You hear a lot of diplomats talking about a crisis of multilateralism, but that's a rather vague phrase. I think there are three crises. There's a crisis of power, because the US, China, and to some extent Russia are really competing to control the multilateral system. There's a crisis of relevance, because the UN doesn't have frameworks for dealing with emerging technologies like AI. And there's a crisis of legitimacy, because the UN isn't dealing with the public's concerns about inequality or perhaps migration in the way that they want. European diplomats save multilateralism day to day. If you look at an organisation like the UN, you'll find that the EU's members convene about 4/5 of the working groups around the General Assembly. And for this year's Climate Action Summit in New York, EU members were leading about 1/3 of the working groups preparing for the summit. EU diplomats do multilateralism out of habit, and they're also innovating. We've seen France and Germany launch a new alliance for multilateralism, which has led 60 countries to sign up to new pledges around cyber and international humanitarian law. So the EU can push back against a very difficult anti-multilateralist tide. I think 15 or 20 years ago, European diplomats that imagined that in the end every country would sign up to liberal values and every country would follow policies similar to the EU. We know that's not true. We've got to work with other countries on a case-by-case basis. So it's essential to work with China on climate change, even if we can't agree on human rights. It's essential to work with Islamic countries in terms of protecting the Muslim minority in Myanmar, even if we have differences over values. We live in an age where you need to be pragmatic, not too principled for your own good. The overwhelming threat to the multilateral system today is the emergence of bipolar competition between Beijing and Washington. Now that doesn't start in the multilateral system. That starts in the economic sphere, that starts in the security sphere in the Pacific. But if Beijing and Washington are increasingly strategic competitors, that will lead them to treat the UN and other multilateral forums as battlefields, where they vie for advantage. And we're already seeing that even now in the Security Council on issues like Afghanistan. The EU has to work with different coalitions on different sets of problems. So one area where the EU needs to focus a lot of strategic attention, and to some extent military attention, is dealing with terrorism and disorder in the Sahel. But to do that, the Europeans need to work with countries in the region, like Nigeria or Niger, to find sustainable strategies to contain jihadi groups. Conversely, the EU needs to work with technologically advanced countries to set new standards on artificial intelligence, cyber, and other new technologies. Now that means working with a completely different set of countries, including Asian countries, that have expertise in those areas. There's no one-size-fits-all group for the EU. NATO will continue to play a crucial role, just as it did in the Cold War, as the centre for territorial defence of Europe, although clearly political tensions with countries like Turkey make that harder. What I think President Macron has recognised, especially in his talk about the need for outreach to Russia, is that you cannot sustain a global multilateral system if big powers are not willing to sit down and talk about their differences. And we know that the big powers of today are going to disagree on many issues, but if all they do is go to the Security Council and shout at each other, or meet in UN disarmament committees and shout at each other, then that doesn't make us any safer. So we at least have to look for spaces of cooperation. In 2020, EU leaders will most probably have to deal with the much delayed reality of Brexit. And in the multilateral sphere, Brexit is going to be a problem because the UK has been at the centre of European diplomacy in organisations like the UN for many years. We need to find some sort of framework that allows the EU 27 and the British to continue to work together on multilateral problems, because on its own the UK will lose influence, and without the UK, the European Union will have less expertise and fewer political networks to bank on in organisations like the UN.